All right. Well, it's noon on the dot here, Wednesday, May 1st, 2024. We can see folks filtering in, and as always, we'll allow a little bit of extra time as folks are maybe coming in from a sunny afternoon, maybe settling down with some lunch, hopping from one Zoom call to the next. But really, really appreciative for you all joining us, and really, really grateful for these awesome speakers and presenters who are joining us today to talk about the immense renewable energy potential available in Cook Inlet and ongoing efforts to harness that local resource. First of all, I just want to begin by recognizing that I myself am zooming in from the unceded territories of the Alaskan peoples in Likanani, or also known as Juneau. And here at REAP, we draw immense inspiration from the Alaska Native peoples who have developed innovative practices for thriving here and have stewarded these lands for time immemorial. And we really continually seek to follow their leadership and vision in doing our work to promote the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency across Alaska. So just want to invite folks as you file in here to carry that recognition forward with you in your approach to this collective work. And to help you get started, I'll share a handy link that allows you to look up whose native lands you're on, and would encourage folks to sort of share that information in the chat along with your name and affiliation. So there's that link for folks. Just to give you an overview of the webinar today before we really dive into the meat of the presentations, we've got Levi Kilcher from the Arctic Energy Office here, as well as David Clark from Alaskan Marine Power. And we're going to sort of proceed in that order of operations. Levi is going to give us an overview, sort of drawing on not a single report, but a few different reports on as I mentioned, the immense renewable energy potential in Cook Inlet. There's many studies he's helped to write on really the renewable energy resource all over coastal Alaska. So he'll give sort of an overview and an inventory of those resources available to us. And then David will give a presentation on Alaska Marine Power's ongoing efforts to harness those resources, but specifically just some offshore wind power here in Cook Inlet and all of the potential uses. So they've got their slides here and they can sort of drive it. I'll be sharing resources in the chat as well. If anybody has questions, we do have a lot of time budgeted at the end for that. So please log those using the Q&A function. But yeah, this should be an interactive presentation. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Levi and David to introduce themselves and get us started.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Donovan. Are you seeing my slides here?
Sure am.
Great. So yeah, as Donovan said, I am energy advisor at the Arctic Energy Office at the Department of Energy. That is a bit of a change for me recently. I was previously at the National Renewable Energy Lab, leading the marine energy resource characterization work at NREL. Through my background in Alaska and work up here, got this new role with the Arctic Energy Office, and it started in December of this year. And it's been really exciting to be able to focus more on Alaska, which is honestly where my heart is, but also to continue some of the work that I've been doing. I wanted to start by just pointing out that I hope you don't mind that the template, like sort of the background that I'm going to be using throughout my slides, is going to change a little bit. I'm using Department of Energy template and sort of branding to indicate work that I'm doing and have done as part of my role with the Arctic Energy Office. And then you'll see some NREL branding and BOEM logos to indicate some of the work that I did prior to joining the Arctic Energy Office. So that's kind of why you'll see that changing happening throughout my presentation. We created this map, and I really like it because I think it shows Alaska's energy. It sort of gives a very high-level picture of Alaska's energy production and energy distribution system. The production system is represented, primarily by the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the yellow line there, extending from Prudhoe Bay down to Valdez. And then the distribution system is represented by the red lines, of course, the Railbelt's there in the middle of the state, and there's several other transmission lines throughout Southeast and other parts of the state. And then, of course, rural Alaska and all the microgrids we have are represented. Not all the communities, of course, in Alaska are shown, but I think at least it highlights the fact that there are all these microgrids that are also providing energy to Alaskans. And before I get rolling, I have got a bit of a pop quiz for everybody. I want to know if anyone knows what the size of Alaska's outer continental shelf, so that's like federal waters, how much federal waters land area, water area is there relative to the size of the state of Alaska? So if you think it's about the same size as Alaska, or smaller than Alaska, or way bigger than Alaska, you think it's twice as big, 5 times as big, half as big, just whatever number you want to punch into the chat. Donovan's going to be tracking that for me. Boehm, I'm looking at you guys. You better get it right. And I'll come back to it on slide 4. So before I go there, just wanted to highlight a few recent DOE award announcements that I think are really exciting. In early February, the Water Power Technologies Office announced their awards for the tidal and current energy FOA. So that, and their selections were 2 projects. One is Ocean Renewable Power Company, was awarded for their American Tidal Energy Project, which is in Cook Inlet. And then Orcas Power and Light in the Orcas Island. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the group of islands, but the Sailor Sea, Washington State. They have also been awarded a project to test a tidal energy device. Those 2 projects are competing for a down select second phase where they would actually deploy technology. So in this first phase, it's mostly focused on sort of permitting and stakeholder engagement and project planning and those kinds of things. I'm not going to talk too much about those projects. That's, I see that as being very much in their court at this point, but it's very exciting, I think, for me personally to see those projects moving forward. And then as well, UAF, ASAP, and the community of Galena collaborated on a project to test river energy devices in the river there in Galena. And that's another big, I think another big win for the state of Alaska. In late February, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, their Energy Improvements in Rural and Remote Areas program made some big announcements of awards. And here I've just highlighted the ones for Alaska. So there's the clean energy in the Northwest Arctic Borough got almost $55 million. The Thayer Creek Hydroelectric Project. These are really big dollar awards. And I think it's really exciting for the state. I think these projects are going to be game changing for these communities. And it's, having been involved in the energy space in Alaska for a long time, I've felt like these kinds of investments, these levels of investments were needed to actually change the game and sort of get from sort of this continually addressing challenges to actually being able to have some new and forward-looking infrastructure. So I think that's really exciting. And same, and then just yesterday, actually, there were some more OSET announcements that came out, a little bit smaller dollar awards, but again, I think these projects have the potential to be really game-changing in these communities. So really excited to see that coming out. Before I dive into the details, I just wanted to briefly summarize kind of the reports that I'll be talking about. So the Boehm report that we did when I was still at NREL, where we looked at the marine energy, ocean energy resources of Alaska's outer continental shelf. That was a collaboration of a big group of people. Really proud of that work. I'll also be talking briefly about the hydrogen opportunities report that I worked on as part of my onboarding here at the Arctic Energy Office. And then there's this integrating tidal energy into Cook Inlet, integrating Cook Inlet tidal energy into the Railbelt. analysis that I'll touch on briefly, and that was work really led by Marty Schwartz and Ben McGilton at NREL, as well as Greg Stark. Those guys did a great job on that. I'll touch on that one. And then last, I was not a co-author of this last report, but the 80% RPS for the Railbelt. I'll touch on that briefly and kind of how I feel like it plays into what we're talking about today. So to kick it off, you know, I've been showing this slide quite a bit the last few years, or I would say the last year or so, as part of the BOEM work. So what we did is we quantified the wave, tidal, and offshore wind resources for the state of Alaska, all of the BOEM planning areas. And this is, the units here are in gigawatts of installed capacity. And the thing that first jumps out here is that offshore wind is the dominant resource throughout the Alaska region. And that's largely because the OCS of Alaska is so large. There's basically just a lot of land or water space over which you could build wind turbines. Whereas tidal and wave energy resources tend to be more so tidal energy is more intense in sort of coastal locations where the coastline focuses the flow. And then wave energy resources, right, like they propagate towards the coastline. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to capture that resource way out at shore when it's going to propagate towards the shoreline anyway. So the point there being that these resources are all relatively comparable in magnitude when you're looking at the relative to what you're seeing here, when you're looking at the near coastal zone. But when you go to like the entire outer continental shelf extending 200 or more nautical miles from shore, offshore wind is certainly the big opportunity to be had. We looked at 6 case studies in this report. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ones in Cook Inlet in a little more detail. But just to clarify, we looked at 2 offshore wind projects in outside of Nome. We looked at 1 offshore wind project on Alaska, 2 offshore wind projects in Cook Inlet, and 1 tidal energy project in Cook Inlet. We didn't look at wave energy because basically we see that technology as sort of being too far out. The technology is still emerging very much. And so we just didn't feel like we had enough confidence in what the costs and constraints were to do a detailed case study. Okay, so here's a picture of the Cook Inlet tidal energy resource. This is the most energetic resource in the country. Almost a third of the nation's tidal energy is located here. If you live here or maybe grew up here like I did, you know that the tidal amplitude is can be almost as big as like 30 feet. And those large tidal amplitudes, of course, drive large volumes of flow through the channel. We are looking at this site here off of the East Foreland, where the flow pinches and where it accelerates. Is the site that I've made some measurements and that ORPC is planning their project. In the case study, we looked in federal waters at this Anchor Point site. Because we were doing this work for BOEM, we wanted to look at federal waters. This site does have somewhat weaker currents, but it is still relatively close to transmission. This East Foreland site is especially promising because it's close to transmission. And the other, I think important attribute of this Anchor Point site is that it's outside of beluga whale critical habitat area. So potentially some interest there. This is now jumping to the tidal energy integration study that was led by Marty Schwartz and Ben McGilton at NREL. Just really quick, this plot, what we're looking at is installing larger and larger amounts of a tidal energy array at the East Foreland. How much of that energy doesn't get used? So zero curtailment means you're using all of the energy. So we sort of see that as good, whereas as you increase the size of the array, what we see it happens in this base case, which is basically the grid as it is today, is that around 200 megawatts, you start to see exceed this 5% threshold, above which we assume the project is non-economical. But then, so that's sort of like the scale of a project that sort of would fit into the Railbelt grid as it exists today. I want to draw your attention to this transmission, this purple line, which actually falls under this red line. Basically, that's installing that's with the GRIP funded cable that would connect Beluga to Nikiski. And so when you add that transmission, then you're able to add more tidal energy to the grid. And so you can get up closer to like 300 megawatts of installed tidal capacity before you exceed this 5% threshold. The one thing I want to clarify is this analysis does not account for cost, right? Like we're just kind of forcing this tidal energy in and seeing how much of it actually gets used at these different scales. The other thing is it doesn't account for new renewables being added to the grid, right? So we expect this tidal energy, these tidal energy projects potentially to be coming online as early as 2035, 2040. And we also expect a lot of renewables to be added to the grid that will make it more complicated. So I think a conservative estimate of how much of like the maximum size of a tidal energy array in Cook Inlet would be something like 100 megawatts. But I think another important detail to think about there is HEA's grid on the peninsula is 50 megawatts. So if you build 100 megawatts at the Forelands, you got to have agreements with other utilities to buy that power, and you got to have the transmission capacity to get it there. So this analysis says there is the transmission capacity, but you got to think about which utilities are going to be buying that power if you're going that big. Okay, now jumping to wind resource in the case study, the Cook Inlet case studies. Our case studies looked at this dark blue patch to the southeast of Augustine Island, where the wind speeds are in excess of 10 meters per second on average. Like throughout the year, the average wind speeds in this area of Cook Inlet is greater than 10 meters per second, and that's consistent across day or night. So that's great that we have this, there isn't much of a diurnal cycle as well. But the other thing is there is a seasonal cycle. And what's interesting about this is that the resource is strongest in the winter and the fall. And to me, that's really intriguing because that says that that's when we need the most energy. So this resource potentially matches the load that we have and tells me that maybe you could have wind to heat. This could be providing electricity that's powering heaters in the state. So I think this resource is really interesting from that standpoint. Really briefly, we also did a cost analysis of all these different case studies that we looked at. The thing I just want to highlight here is that these LCOE numbers, these are sort of the estimates that we came up with for these projects. Levelized cost of energy, if you're not familiar, is sort of the cost per megawatt hour or kilowatt hour of power produced. These costs, the offshore wind costs are comparable to kind of costs that exist today for offshore wind projects, but that's the nuance here is that this analysis was actually done for 2035, and we expect costs in the continental US to come down significantly. So sort of the apples to apples comparison here is that these costs are much higher than similar offshore wind projects in the continental US. But this is what we estimate. And, you know, I know David probably has a lot to say about this, and I'm hoping he has got some genius ideas about how he's going to drive these costs down. The other thing I want to say here is that the tidal energy costs are much, much higher than the offshore wind costs. And that's just due to the fact that the technology is much less mature. We have a lot less confidence in what those costs will actually be when the technology is commercial. But yeah, that's what I was wanting to say about the cost. Okay, jumping to the hydrogen report that we came out with. This was sort of an opportunity for me to step back from a focus on marine energy resources and think about all of Alaska's resources, land-based, solar, wind, and other renewable energy resources. And I wanted to draw your attention to these sort of 3 sub-bullets here, that Alaska has vast renewable energy resources that could be used to produce hydrogen. We also have large gas resources that could be combined with carbon capture to produce clean hydrogen. Hydrogen represents an opportunity to provide seasonal storage for communities, and we also have storage opportunities for storing that hydrogen to be able to export it. And I think David's going to talk more about that. This is a picture of Alaska's wind speed, is a map of Alaska's wind speeds. And the thing I wanted to point out here is that in the continental US, there's recently been some analysis where they look at, like, what if you covered 30% of the continental US with wind turbines, how much power would you get? And I basically tried to repeat that analysis here in Alaska. And I said, what if you covered 30% of Alaska with wind turbines, how much power would you get? I know that's like just kind of an insane amount of land to be covering with wind turbines, but I think it helps give us a bounding of, like, what really is the opportunity here? What's 30% look like? What's 1% of the state look like? Those kinds of things. Just wanted to note for people is a little more of like an on the ground picture of what like 1% of Alaska means. 1% is roughly all of the Susitna Valley. So like from Denali down to like Point McKenzie, that whole region is not quite 1% of Alaska. Or the Kenai Peninsula is like 1.5% of Alaska. So just wanted to give people sort of an idea of what those land areas mean. But what's interesting is that you could equal the state's current energy production by covering just 2% of the state. I'm not proposing we do that in the Susitna Valley or the Kenai Peninsula. You know, I think maybe there's other regions that you think about these ideas, but nonetheless, that, you know, it's a relatively small fraction of the state produces vast amounts of energy. Oh, and I forgot to go to the quiz. Donovan, did anyone get close to the right answer?
Yeah, so let's see. Well, first off, I'll note everyone was directionally correct, saying that the continental shelf is larger than the state's landmass. Mick Bradaway was the closest with 2 times. There are a number of folks who get 3 times. I'll give an honorable mention to Dave Myers, who said it depends on whether you ask the Russians.
Yeah, so it's like 2.4x is roughly the size of the OCS relative to the size of Alaska. And so because of that, you know, you occupy a relatively small fraction of the OCS to get the same amount of energy out. Okay, trying to wrap up here really quick for y'all. To put these numbers in a little bit more context, here's the total US energy consumption per year. It's 100,000 trillion BTUs, or sometimes it's called a quadrillion BTUs, so 100 quadrillion BTUs is how much the country consumes. Alaska consumes only 675 trillion BTUs, and that's about the thickness of this black line on this scale here. If we add up all of the renewable energy potential of Alaska, it's actually quite comparable to the nation's energy consumption. Here you're seeing the offshore wind potential and the land-based wind potential. Each of those are occupying about 30% of the land and the OCS. The solar potential in this case, I said, what if you occupied 5% of the state's land? And similarly with wave and tidal. Geothermal is a little bit of a question mark. We're trying to get to the bottom of that. That's one of the things I'm working on inside the Arctic Energy Office. Another thing I want to point out here is this is just the electricity generation energy. If you were to, like, for example, produce hydrogen, there's going to be a 30 to 50% knockdown in sort of the energy content of the hydrogen that comes out of your project. So that's going to scale down. But still, the point is, there's a lot of renewable energy potential that could be used to either power things directly locally, whether that's local industry, or to produce products that we export. Really quickly, I wanted to touch on the energy Earthshots portfolio. I think there's a lot of these Earthshots that are relevant to Alaska, especially the ones that I've circled. But these Earthshots are actually focused on driving down the costs of technologies or the costs in each of these areas. And I'm not sure Alaska is the place where we're going to drive the costs down. But what I'd like to think is that once those costs come down and other parts of the country are starting to have constraints on their land use policy, maybe Alaska will be start to look at as an opportunity for implementing these technologies. And I think my key point here, if I had a key point for this whole presentation, is that if we want to do that, if we want to be a state that is looked at as a place where you could build renewable energy projects to support the nation, whether that's making hydrogen fuels or powering data centers or whatever, we need to be starting now on figuring out how the technologies work in Alaska and how to make them successful here, so that when the costs come down, we're ready to scale up and deliver on those goals. And I think the good thing is about that is that NREL's 80% RPS analysis tells us that it's economical now to start doing that. Wind and solar in Alaska is economical now for us compared to the status quo of importing gas as we're facing this gas crisis. And so I think that represents a huge opportunity for us to start investing in future energy technologies and begin transitioning our energy system towards the energy system of the 21st century. I'll leave my thoughts here just for a few, I guess. I think that again, my main point there is that second bullet is that as the cost of these technologies come down, will Alaska be ready to develop its resources? I also want to point out on the jobs front, I feel like I hear a lot of concern about the energy transition taking away jobs, and there are going to be pain points in the employment sector of some transitions, but we're also talking about investing billions of dollars in infrastructure. There are going to be lots of jobs associated with doing that. There's going to be new jobs. There's going to be a lot of old jobs. And I think we can leverage a lot of the workforce of the, and work with the Alaska oil and gas sector to build this infrastructure. Those are the guys who know how to do big things and do them quickly. So yeah, that's me. Thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thanks, Levi. And if you want to end sharing your screen and we can get David loaded up, now we can sort of turn to, with all of that immense renewable energy potential in mind, how Alaska Marine Power is working to harness the offshore wind energy potential in Cook Inlet.
Donovan, can you see the slides?
Sure can.
Okay. Yeah, I'm David Clark, the engineering director for AMP. I have a chemical engineering background. I had a long 36-year career with BP, working in major projects around the world, mainly on the front end. So after a resource was identified, my role was to actually work out a development plan. So 2.5 years ago, ex-colleague from BP, Simon Harrison, and I formed Alaska Marine Power, or AMP, specifically to develop the renewable energy resources in the Cook Inlet. So what I'd like to talk about this morning is covering the creation of an e-fuels export market for Alaska. I'll cover the offshore wind resource and dig in a little bit deeper into the wind resource in the Cook Inlet, talk about potential markets for renewable energy and the challenges of intermittency of the wind, the importance of large-scale hydrogen storage, and then Nikiski today and its potential in the future, and finally conclude with the next steps. So the diagram on the right shows the zooms in on what Levi produced. The scale on this is from 6 meters per second up to 12 meters per second. Although there's about 65 gigawatts of potential in the Cook Inlet, it's a variable quality. So we're really focusing on the best of the best, which is in that red box. So there's at least 10 gigawatts in that box between Mount Augustine to the west and the Barren Islands to the east. The water depth is about 40 meters at Augustine, and it's deep, goes up to about 120 meters at the Barren Islands. 60 meters is generally regarded as the threshold or the limit for fixed bottom structures. So about 1/3 of that box could be developed with a fixed bottom, and 2/3 would require floating technology. It's about 110 miles for a subsea HVDC tie line back to Nikiski, so we're not relying on any grid upgrades. As Levi mentioned, there's been a case study done for a shallow water and a deep water locations, which are shown by the purple and the red dots. The wind quality here is in the top 1% of all US offshore wind resources, and that's shown by the graph up in the top left. In fact, the onshore wind quality is literally off the scale in terms of quality, as shown by that blue star. And as Levi mentioned, there is a drop off in the wind in the spring and the summer months. So why is it so windy? Actually, Lower Cook Inlet is the perfect location, given its topography, to capture wind from all directions. These are screenshots from the Windy app, which I have on my phone. And you can see when the wind's coming from the north, it's actually focused down through the Cook Inlet into that box. From the east, it's focused in from the Gulf of Alaska into the box. From the south, it comes up through the Selikof Strait between the mainland and Kodiak Island. And then from the west, it's focused in over Lake Iliamna. So you can see it's always where it can be blowing 30 to 40 knots in that box, and be relatively calm or even dead calm in Anchorage, where Fire Island is located. Give you an idea of the scale. Got the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower. The schematic on the left, or to the right of the Eiffel Tower, is Fire Island. So it's a 1.6 megawatt turbine, and it's about the same height as the Statue of Liberty. When you go offshore, you can put in much larger turbines. What we're looking at is a 15 megawatt capacity, which is now becoming standard. And it's as high as the Eiffel Tower. What's really key about the Lower Cook Inlet, it's got a very high capacity factor, which is 64%. The capacity factor is really the percentage of the nameplate capacity that it will produce on average throughout the year. So with a 15 megawatt turbine, it would produce just under 10 megawatts on average throughout the year. And that is very high. Just to give you an idea of the size, this is the nacelle for a 12 megawatt GE machine. And you can see just how small the people are in comparison. And this weighs about 500 tons. So you can see how difficult this would be to install onshore. For the shallow water locations, you need a very specialized wind turbine installation vessel. This is an artist's impression of the Sharborus, which is the first US flag vessel that's currently being constructed in Texas. It can actually load up with the components for 5 to 7 turbines at a marshalling yard, sail out to location, then it jacks itself up so that it's rock steady, and it can install a complete turbine in 1 to 2 days. The alternative in deeper water, we would be relying on infrastructure being developed for the Pacific coast. So basically the complete assembly can be constructed in a marshalling yard, say in Tacoma, and then towed up to location and anchored. The advantage of this is you don't need the very specialized and expensive installation vessels. However, as Levi showed in his slide, these are currently about 25% more expensive than the fixed bottom turbines, but we expect as more of these are developed that the costs will come down over time. This is probably the most important slide I have. Because of the long transmission tieback distance, we're probably looking at about a 1 gigawatt as being what's required to get the economies of scale for this project. And that's about double what the whole Railbelt uses. So we have to actually create a market for the energy. And the obvious one is to produce hydrogen by electrolysis. And then that hydrogen could be a feedstock for the ammonia plant that's currently mothballed down in Nikiski. It just needs to pull nitrogen from the air, and it's got all the feedstock it needs to produce green ammonia for the export market. If we can get a source of carbon, we can also produce e-fuels, methanol, e-gasoline, e-diesel, and e-kerosene, commonly known as sustainable aviation fuel. The carbon dioxide could come from CO2 imports. Japan is looking to export, I think it's 13 million tons a year by 2030. It could come from direct air capture, direct ocean capture, although that's not currently commercially viable, or it could come from local sources if we develop a coal power plant in Alaska with carbon sequestration. The key point here, and this is the biggest challenge, is that e-fuels plants for commercial and operational reasons need a constant feedstock 24/7, 365 days a year, and the wind is intermittent. So we really need, as an enabling technology, the capability of storing large volumes of hydrogen. We're talking 20, 30,000 tons. It would be phenomenally expensive to do that on the surface. So we're looking at underground storage in depleted gas reservoirs. If this infrastructure is developed, then there are ancillary benefits, local benefits. We could supply renewable power into the electricity grid. We could also supply or blend hydrogen into the natural gas grid, and we could use it for heavy transport and small aircraft. We could also, when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, we could actually pull hydrogen out of storage and use that to generate power to spike into the Railbelt grid. So looking at energy storage technologies, the graph here on the y-axis is minutes. These are log scales. And then on the x-axis, it's energy storage, which goes from 1 kilowatt hour all the way up to 1 terawatt hour. So to give you an impression of what a terawatt hour is, for reference, the Railbelt grid generates about just under 5 terawatt hours per annum. So energy can be stored as potential energy, kinetic energy, electrical energy, but the big kahuna is storing it as chemical energy. And currently hydrogen is stored in salt caverns. But unfortunately, that's not an option for Alaska. So we're looking at storing the hydrogen in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And the storage capacity is practically unlimited. We can store tens of terawatt hours of energy in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So this has been studied extensively by the Shasta team, which is made up of 4 national labs. In April 22, they put together a subsurface hydrogen and natural gas storage report. This was very, very scientific. It was around 80 pages. And they recognized when they produced the report that they needed to put together guidelines for project developers so that they could actually select the ideal reservoir for hydrogen storage. And then in September of last year, Shasta also put together a technical economic analysis comparing subsurface hydrogen storage in depleted gas reservoirs and also in salt caverns. So this slide is from that report. In the schematic, you can see the wells being drilled on the left, the wells being drilled into a depleted gas reservoir. And on the right, you can see wells being drilled into a salt dome. And the light blue colors are 2 caverns that are developed due to leaching out the salt. On the left, you can see bar charts that give the relative costs. The actual cost of the subsurface equipment is roughly comparable, but the big difference is in the cost of creating the volume. With a depleted gas reservoir, the pore space is already there. You don't have to create it. Whereas with the cavern, you actually have to mine out the salt, and that's expensive. So with a depleted gas reservoir, if you want to double the volume of storage, you just pick a bigger reservoir. But with a salt cavern, you're actually going to double the storage development cost. So these slides are from a Shasta workshop that was carried out a couple of months ago. So in the gold are the salt deposits in the US. The green is hydrocarbon basins. and the blue is sedimentary basins. And you can see that the Gulf Coast is well served with salt deposits, as is the mid-continent, and also to a smaller extent the Northeast. What's really significant is that there is no salt deposits in Alaska nor in the Western US. There are 3 existing underground hydrogen storage facilities. These are the yellow diamonds in Texas, and there's one being developed in Utah by Mitsubishi. So if we overlay that with the clean hydrogen hubs, you can see that the Pacific Northwest and the California hydro hubs do not have an option to store large volumes of renewable energy as hydrogen in salt caverns. The case is even stronger in Alaska because we don't have the diversity of renewable energy resources that the Western hubs do have. So back last year, we approached the Shasta team and suggested that they use Alaska as a case study to help us select and develop protocols and guidelines as to how to select the ideal reservoir for hydrogen storage. And they looked at 92 hydrocarbon pools, 4 natural gas storage pools, and 5 main producing horizons. They also did a study for Pennsylvania, but it was much higher level and looked at a lot more potential pools. But Pennsylvania doesn't have the demand pool that Alaska has. So how did they do the assessment? First of all, they looked at storage volume. And in the map, you can see the reservoirs and the pools, and the size of the bubble is dependent on the hydrogen working gas energy, again in terawatt hours. And you can see that some of those are well over or approaching 100 terawatt hours. The total hydrogen storage volume, if all the wells had the potential to be storage reservoirs, is almost 300 terawatt hours. So that's sort of 50 years of Railbelt power generation energy, which is absolutely huge. So they identified 29 hydrocarbon pools and 2 natural gas storage pools that could theoretically meet our storage demand. Most of the reservoirs that are offshore in the Cook Inlet are just too big. It would be like storing a needle in a haystack. It'd be difficult to get the hydrogen back out. And then 48 of those pools are currently unused, so they're depleted reservoirs that are available for storage. The other thing they looked at was the physical and chemical suitability. So some formations exhibit higher temperatures and pressures, some have better porosity and permeability, and lower oil saturations. Permeability is very important to us because we want to be able to withdraw the hydrogen at fast rates without having to drill dozens of wells. Temperature is also important because that affects microbial activity and also hydrogen's reactivity with minerals in the rock. Microbial interactions is absolutely critical. Large-scale hydrogen storage won't be possible unless we fully understand the expected microbial activity. Microbes can consume hydrogen and CO2 and turn it into methane. The hydrogen is also super reactive and can react with sulfates and iron in the reservoir and turn the hydrogen into H2S and water. There was a pilot done by Gas de France, and it was a blend of hydrogen and methane, and they actually consumed, the microbes consumed 50% of the stored hydrogen gas. So we need to be very selective in picking our reservoir. So the series of charts on the right look at the mineralogy. Some formations are relatively quartz rich and clay poor, but all exhibit low calcite, no gypsum, and no pyrite. So putting that all together, we circled the potentially favorable characteristics in all the reservoirs. And really the sterling and the Tyonek are the preferred reservoirs for hydrogen storage. So to conclude, they identified 7 out of the 92 pools that are of the right size and potentially have the favorable characteristics for hydrogen storage. And those reservoirs are the Kenai field in the Cannery Loop and Beaver Creeks. Fortunately, all those are onshore and in the vicinity of Nikiski. It's not unsurprising that the reservoirs that are suitable for hydrogen storage are also the ones that are currently being used for natural gas storage. They have the similar characteristics. At the conclusion of the study, a report was written which has been submitted to the Journal of Applied Energy for peer review and hopefully will be published later this year. Looking at Nikiski today, it's an oil and gas hub. We are actually find ourselves in a very similar position to the oil and gas industry back in the 1960s. They were drilling for oil in the Cook Inlet, and they discovered very significant volumes of natural gas. But the domestic market was tiny. So they really had to create a market for that resource. And back in the 60s, they developed the US's first LNG plant, and that remained US's only US LNG export facility for many decades. And they also developed at the time what was the largest, or one of the largest, ammonia plants in the US. Sadly, with the decline in production from the Cook Inlet, both those projects have been mothballed for over a decade. So those are the plants in the background next to the Cook Inlet, and the facility in the foreground is actually the Marathon refinery. On the map on the right, you can see the existing storage facilities, which are in purple at Kenai and Singsa, which is at Cannery Loop, and also up at Swanson River. Beaver Creek is in the green, just to the east of Nikiski. Those projects are actually in the National Wildlife Refuge and on BLM land. And you can see also you have the offshore fields in the Cook Inlet. This is the vision for Nikiski in the future. We can have offshore wind with a power line to Nikiski, hydrolysis there, and storing hydrogen in depleted gas reservoirs to the south of Nikiski, potentially storing CO2 offshore to the north, and generating e-fuels for the export market from the Nikiski Deepwater Port, but also supplying sustainable aviation fuel through an existing pipeline to Anchorage Airport, which uses just under 2 million gallons per day. And the other nice thing about Nikiski, it's an industrial area. It's development friendly, and it's also right there at the foreland, which is the ideal site for one of the ideal sites for tidal energy. So this schematic shows how it all fits together. If we were to develop an e-fuels plant similar to the HIF plant that's being built in Texas, it requires a constant power of about 2 gigawatts. So if we were to develop just over 3 gigawatts of energy, we could produce 2 gigawatts on average throughout the year. So basically, when the wind is blowing, we're producing 3 gigawatts. We send 2 gigawatts worth of hydrogen directly to the e-fuels plant, and we put the excess of 1 gigawatt worth of hydrogen into storage. Then when the wind falls to 2 gigawatts, we're sending all the hydrogen straight to the e-fuels plant. And then when it falls below 2 gigawatts, we're actually pulling hydrogen out of storage and making up to ensure that we have a steady supply to the e-fuels plant. When we pull it out of storage, it will be contaminated with methane and also be wet, so we have to clean it up. But that technology is fully understood. So really, to summarize the characteristics of this is ultra long storage. We can build up an inventory of hydrogen in the winter months to see it through the summer. It's very high capacity. And as I say, the cost is actually proportional to the withdrawal rate and independent of the storage capacity. And we reckon a ballpark figure for storing the hydrogen is about 45 cents per kilogram and gross. But because we're only storing a third of the hydrogen, the net cost is around 15 cents, which is very affordable. But the challenge that we have is no matter how good the science is, no investor is going to spend billions of dollars building an offshore wind farm, developing a storage facility, and building e-fuels plants unless you have physically proven that it works, and ideally proven that it works in the reservoirs that we're looking at. So it's absolutely essential that we do a pilot. And we feel that Alaska at the Kenai Peninsula is probably the ideal place to do a large-scale hydrogen pilot to prove the technology. To date, there's only been one hydrogen pilot that's been completed, and it was very small, and it was done by RAG in Austria. Apparently, there's 3 other pilots that are ongoing in Europe, but to our knowledge, there is no other location in the US that's looking at doing a large-scale pilot. The pilot that we're envisaging will be about 15 times larger than the one that was done in Austria. So to do that, we need, luckily, there's electrolyzers now come in a box. This is the NEL model. Has a power requirement of like 2.5 megawatts. It comes in 2 40-foot containers and a 20-foot container. So you just unload it off the truck, put it on the pad, plug in your power and water supply, and it can produce just over a ton a day of hydrogen. And we probably need about 2 of these for the pilot. So to summarize the way forward, say Shasta team have done some amazing science. They spent about 7 million to date. And then what we're calling phase 1 for Alaska, we've done the resource assessment, which is just being completed. Phase 2, which we're currently planning, would be to put together, to do the studies, to do the reservoir engineering, select the ideal reservoir, handle leasing and permitting, commercial agreements, and engineering design. We reckon that would take about 2 years and cost $5 million. And that would allow us to then sanction the pilot test, which we think would cost between $25 and $35 million. The cost really depends on whether we can reuse existing wells. And that would include, after you build it, about 2 years of multiple injection and withdrawal cycles to see how the reservoir cleans up and to check if we are getting any hydrogen losses. The timeline along the bottom is very much ideal. If it takes us 2 years for phase 2 and 2 years of testing, we could be in a position to declare the technology commercial by 2030. The big uncertainty is permitting. Nobody in the US has ever drilled a well for hydrogen injection into a depleted gas reservoir. The only hydrogen wells that have been permitted are into salt caverns. So that's a really big unknown. We're hoping because this is a pilot, it's of limited scale and limited duration, that the rules can be simplified for that. So in conclusion, Alaska is not only the last frontier, but we feel it's the best frontier for wind power, for hydrogen storage, and for green fuels. I've given my contact details at the bottom. If I don't get to your questions today, please get in touch with me. And particularly if you've got a few $1 million that you would like to invest in the US's first hydrogen storage pilot, then let me know. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, wow, that was a lot of incredible information from the 2 of you. So again, just want to reiterate my thanks. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A function, which I can get to, but just want to use that as a reminder to folks to please log those there. And just also like sort of in furtherance of my gratitude, there's a lot of really just positive comments in the chat. Thank you both for your expertise and for sharing it today. So I want to reflect that. There was one question that I had copied from the chat before I can go to the Q&A, and this one was for Levi. And I know you sort of touched on this, but from Kendra, she's wondering, federal waters in Cook Inlet are fished by drift gill netters from mid-June to mid-August. And so she's curious what interactions between commercial fishing and tidal energy infrastructure have been looked at. I know you mentioned the beluga population, but maybe if you wanted to add to that at all.
I would say that that's an area, another area of active research, and that's, I think, an area that these demonstration projects need to address. And I think that's where ORPC is now, is in the process of reaching out to the fishing community to, start that dialogue. How can we run this project and do the monitoring necessary to capture the data that the fishermen need to feel confident, as well as capture the data that ORPC needs to understand how to manage these projects so that they can mitigate the fisheries risks. I think all of that needs to be looked at.
I can address a simple question. Are oil and gas reservoirs used for hydrogen storage, do they compete with potential CCUS storage areas? The answer is no, because we're looking at a different order of magnitude of scale. So you really, for CCUS, you really want a large reservoir because you're going to put the hydrogen, put the CO2 in there and hope that it stays there for eternity. For hydrogen storage, we're looking at much smaller reservoirs, so they're not in competition.
Thanks, David. And yeah, if you guys see, I note that Levi is also typing out some responses to the questions here too. So maybe I'll just include those in our follow-up resources so folks have the benefit of seeing the questions and the written answers. I'll keep reading some of these off, but feel free. I know you two can see them as well. So if you want to answer in real time, let me know. But I'll just keep going down the list. And I know this one is also for Levi, just referencing slide 14. This asker maybe not as easy to sort of answer without that slide pulled up, but the question is, how does the information apply to non-Railbelt communities? For example, what renewable technologies are cost effective to deploy? And I know you mentioned those other case studies. Maybe that's sort of a good high level anchor for an answer to that question. Otherwise, I'm sure we could follow up with the relevant resources as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of really successful solar projects in rural Alaska lately, right? Like the advantage of solar compared to wind is like solar panels have much lower operations and maintenance costs. And so, you know, I think that's something that rural communities can manage. But there's also been, I think we're starting to see some success with wind projects in rural communities. And the critical thing there, I think, is bringing those communities along and developing a local workforce, whether it's, you know, actually people in the community or like a network of people in neighboring communities that are able to operate and maintain those turbines. I think that's one of the critical issues. But you know, I think that those both wind and solar are viable now in rural Alaska.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, to answer the question on can the wind turbines can they be rated to withstand extreme wind gusts? The answer is yes. Above about 10 meters per second, the blades are feathered, and they can easily operate up to about 25 meters per second, and then in which case they're shut down. But there's been multiple wind turbines installed in Asia that are designed to withstand hurricane force winds.
And I want to grab the question about wind power. So it's from Curtis Fincher. Do I understand that wind power in Cook Inlet scaled to supply the Railbelt only is not cost feasible due to insufficient scale? The reference study for that. So I think here we need to clarify the difference between land-based wind and offshore wind, right? Like offshore wind is more expensive. It's more of an emerging technology. I think there's more room for offshore wind costs to continue to come down. Land-based wind is relatively mature, and the NREL Railbelt RTS study, which was one of my last slides, says clearly that land-based wind is economical now in Alaska on the Railbelt compared to the status quo. What David's talking about is offshore wind. And so, David, I'll let you answer that question with regard to offshore wind.
Yeah, so for the Railbelt, they really want a diversified source of multiple renewable energy sources, so that when one stops producing, they're not faced with the sort of blackouts. So basically, from offshore wind, the Railbelt could probably only sort of accommodate 100 to 200 megawatts, and that would just be uneconomical for us to develop. But if the offshore wind farm is developed to support an export e-fuels market, then then energy could be tied into the Railbelt grid easily. But it wouldn't be cost effective we wouldn't have the economies of scale to develop a wind farm just for the Railbelt.
Great. And I'll just say a few things. One, it's 12:59, so I can offer a few sort of like conclusory remarks, and then maybe we can stick on and answer questions if our presenters have a bit more time. But a big one here is just, again, like intense gratitude for the expertise you're sharing today and real interest in not only the recording of the webinar, but the presentations, which I hope our presenters are comfortable sharing with folks as well. I can certainly disseminate, and then also just continued collaboration with the two of you. And so contact information certainly on the back of those slides. I also just want to say these two will be presenting similar, I'm sure, updated information at the Energy Security the Sustainable Energy Conference here in Anchorage at the end of this coming month. So really encourage folks to register and attend and engage with the speakers there. Obviously, a lot of great information will be available there as well. And REAP staff will be there to connect, and just really want to sort of ground this in. The whole motivation for this speaker series is to bring incredible presenters to you folks and sort of ignite further conversations and collaboration sort of toward that mission that REAP has, I mentioned on the top, of accelerating the development of renewable energy and promoting energy efficiency statewide. So it's 1 on the dot. If folks want to leave, certainly your prerogative, and just appreciate you joining. And if our presenters have a bit more time, maybe we could answer a few more questions, but resources to come, and really appreciate folks joining. Did the two of you have any other questions? I read a few off, but any others that stick out to you as important to address before folks tune out? And maybe while we're just perusing, there is a long list of them here as well. So I encourage folks to reach out. And I'll just maybe piggyback off of Levi's answer to the question about applicability of renewable energy resources in rural communities as well. I mean, I know Dave Myers in the chat was talking about there is decades of experience working in rural communities to integrate renewables, and there's questions here just sort of about that process and the expertise we have in state as well. So really sort of, again, just grounds, REAP tries to convene all the folks who are working on these, who have those experiences and expertise, and who would provide that information to folks who are curious. So never hesitate to reach out to me or to my colleagues as well, and we can connect you with those folks as well. But yeah, these are incredibly busy and obviously very knowledgeable presenters. So I want to respect their time and everybody else's as well. We had another great turnout, so really grateful to everybody who tunes in. We do have one more coming up 2 weeks from today on the rural independent power producer model and its benefits across Alaska. So stay tuned for promotions on that. But I'll let you all go. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday here, and hope to talk to you again real soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.